Book of the Dead becoming God in ancient Egypt. Production and use. How a Book of the Dead manuscript was produced. The ritual context of the Book of the Dead. For over a century, students of the Egyptian Book of the Dead have researched its contents, history, and meaning in great detail. Still, the ritual context of the composition is not fully understood. It is hard to imagine that the lengthy manuscripts detailing the journey to and through the afterlife were just quietly placed in the tomb, in close proximity to the mummy, without accompanying actions. So, when, where, and in what capacity were these spells actually used? The answers may be found in the texts themselves, sometimes stated explicitly in a spell's instructions or, in other cases, deduced from the titles, content, or media on which they were written. A spell's occurrence on non-mortuary objects may also hint at its ritual context that possibly lies outside the sphere of death. The ritual actions involving Book of the Dead spells vary greatly, as they connect with discrete points in one's journey through life, death, and the distant afterlife. As expected, most of these spells figure in rituals of the funeral and mortuary cult for mortuary literature, intended for use by the deceased in the afterlife, and funerary liturgies that were enacted for the benefit of the deceased, primarily intended to benefit the deceased. However, many of these spells were also used in rituals by the living, either in anticipation of post-mortem transformation or in a completely different, non-funerary function as temple liturgies or magical and protective incantations. Because Books of the Dead are compilations of spells rather than true books, copying, reinterpreting, and adding to each manuscript was in itself a complex ritual activity performed by priest-scribes. This chapter presents a brief overview of the various rituals surrounding the Book of the Dead. Rituals for the Dead. Books of the Dead are above all associated with rituals meant to help the deceased in navigating the perils of the netherworld and in transforming into a spirit capable of communicating, moving about, and receiving food and drink. Recited before, during, and after the burial on subsequent visits to the tomb. These spells were believed to assist one's transfiguration. Instructions at the beginning, or end of spells, directed the officiant to vocalize the incantations at specified points during embalming, offering, or funerary rites. Many such instructions state the specific time and place of a spell's intended recitation. The location and time of others are implied by their titles or context. The directions, however, are distinctly formulaic and should be taken with a grain of salt. For instance, the most common instruction, was to be spoken by Pien the deceased, was not meant literally. While the deceased in the netherworld was perhaps the intended speaker, at some point in the history of mortuary literature, by the time this formula appears in Books of the Dead, it functioned largely to mark breaks in a spell. Rituals before burial. Several spells belonged with rituals that had to be performed before the day of burial, that is, in conjunction with embalming rites that were held soon after death, although not explicitly identified. As such, the place of these spells among pre-burial rites is implied by their context. Some spells were part of the hourly wake rituals that were held in the place of embalming on the night before burial. More common were instructions for recitation over specific amulets placed on clearly identified body parts, pointing to concurrence with wrapping rituals. The rubric of Spell 163 prescribes its reading over two-winged wadjet eyes, a serpent with legs, and other mystical images drawn, on fresh linen, with which a man and all his limbs are wrapped. The subsequent spell 164 was to be recited over an image of a three-faced mutt, on a red bandage binding the chest of the deceased. Clearly associated with the action of wrapping the embalmed body, the ritual recitation of these spells combined with the magical power of images to protect the deceased in the afterlife.